Assalamu alaikum, everyone. I'm so pleased to welcome all of you. It's wonderful to see such a good turnout, and I think it's going to increase. My name is Hayat Imam. I'll be your moderator for the evening. I'm a member of Mass Peace Action and Dorchester People for Peace, who are the organizers of this webinar with Dr. Maha Hilal. Dr. Hilal will speak for about 35 minutes, and then we'll open up for audience questions. But unfortunately, due to time constraints, we request that you write your questions into the chat. I think that would be great. And my colleague, Omar Ahmad, who is an organizer at Mass Peace Action, he'll present your questions to Dr. Hilal. We hope to get to as many questions as time will allow. Dr. Hilal has agreed to stay a few minutes beyond 8 p.m., so hopefully we will get to all your questions, but do put it in the chat. So I'm just going to start by introducing Dr. Maha Hilal. Dr. Maha Hilal is co-director of Justice for Muslims Collective and a researcher and writer on institutionalized Islamophobia. Her writings have been published very widely, including in Newsweek, in Business Insider, Middle East Eye, and Truthout. First, Maha, let me congratulate you on your book. The book is called Innocent Until Proven Muslim, The War on Terror and the Muslim Experience Since 9/11. I believe the book will be actually published on January 25, 2022. But we are so pleased that you've joined us for this webinar organized by Mass Peace Action and Dorchester People for Peace. And we're really, really happy to be one of the early venues where we can discuss the important issues that you raise in your book. We also hope to support the book by getting the word out about it and letting people know how they can pre-order the book. We will either pre-order before it comes out or when it does come out in January. And we will be sending all of you links on how to do that. So I am a Muslim myself, and I came here as a college student in 1964. And one of the things I think I've had to learn is that when people look at you, they do not really see you. What they see instead are the assumptions they have made about you. And I'll admit that I think we're all a little bit guilty of this at times. So my experience back in the 70s was that those assumptions Americans made about Muslims were not always accurate, but they were not necessarily mean or distrustful or really what's happened now, I guess. By and large, I would say they were quite benign back then. But over time, that has certainly changed, with dramatic shifts occurring after 9/11. So Maha, we look forward to your analysis of what it has been like for Muslims to be seen and treated as terrorists and suspects, not only by American people, but also by the state. So welcome, Maha. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hayat, for the introduction, and thank you to you and Ammar for putting together this event. I'm really thrilled to be here with all of you tonight. It's unfortunate that we are now at 20 years of the war on terror, and yet what we see is that the violence has continued to be perpetuated with absolutely no slowdown. So I'm looking forward to this discussion and definitely welcome questions. So please jot them down as I'm speaking, and happy to answer whatever questions you have. Should I just launch into the presentation? Okay. So as Hayat mentioned, my book is called Innocent Until Proven Muslim, Islamophobia, the War on Terror, and the Muslim Experience Since 9/11. This book was supposed to come out this year to mark the 20-year anniversary of the 9/11 attacks and the onset of the war on terror. It was delayed a bit just because of printing backups, but nevertheless, this was supposed to be sort of a book, and it is a book, that seeks to examine what has evolved in the course of the last 20 years. And to me, one of the biggest things, and one of the points that I wanted to most emphasize, is how deeply rooted Islamophobia has been throughout the war on terror. For a lot of us in this audience, including those who identify as Muslim, this is something obvious, right? We have known from the beginning of the war on terror that it in fact was designed to target Muslims. However, in various policy spaces, including progressive and left policy spaces, it has often been the case that this element, that is that Muslims are the primary targets and that Islamophobia is part and parcel to the war on terror, has been neglected. So one of the goals in my book was to mainstream this analysis. And when we talk about mainstreaming an analysis, what does that mean? You could think about other fields, for example, peace building and conflict resolution, where there is talk about mainstreaming a gender analysis. And what this essentially means is that you can't talk about the war on terror without addressing Islamophobia. That in order to understand how it has unfolded and how we can dismantle it, that this necessarily includes this analysis. I've been in spaces for many years where policy advocates, organizers, et cetera, have talked about Guantanamo Bay. In the couple years in the beginning when I started organizing around Guantanamo, it was rarely ever the case, for example, that people would explicitly mention the fact that all of the prisoners at Guantanamo were Muslim and are Muslim. This seems like an obvious fact, obvious observation, yet it's only been in the last couple years that people have explicitly acknowledged this fact. However, when we have acknowledged this fact, right, it kind of just stops there. So we say that now we can, most people can say that, okay, everyone at Guantanamo is Muslim, but then where do we go from there? What does that actually mean beyond this observation? And it means that there's something that's not coincidental about the fact that everyone detained at Guantanamo has been and is Muslim. So my book really, again, with all of these points in mind, is also about making Islamophobia measurable, right? It's not just a feeling Muslims have that we're being targeted. There are specific ways to understand and make measurable Islamophobia. And in the book, I talk about this idea of social constructions in policy design. And this is a framework based on the work of Helen Ingram and Ann Schneider, where they really look at the different ways groups are constructed. That is, what are the images that are perpetuated? What are the stereotypes? And how do those images, constructions, and stereotypes enter into the policy process, whether it's through design or whether it's through implementation? One of the easiest ways to think about this concept of social construction and policy design is if, for example, if you look at drug sentencing laws. So when it comes to understanding the discrepancy in terms of which drugs get a longer sentence, it's really not usually ever about the lethality of the drug, but instead, what groups are thought to use what kind of drugs and what constructions of that group exist. So for example, right, when we think about who is characteristically associated with certain drugs, whatever the construction of that group is, determines how long the sentence will be. So again, it's not about lethality. So when we think about that analysis and the war on terror, we think about the construction of Muslims as inherently violent, inherently terroristic, irredeemable, barbaric, uncivilized, etc. And when you have these constructions embedded into the laws and policies of the war on terror, the end result is there cannot be any intervention other than violence to address Muslims. So, there have been many 20-year anniversaries in this past couple months, and we're now about to enter the 20-year anniversary of the opening of Guantanamo in 2002. And throughout all of this, from the beginning, the United States has always put itself in the position of being the victim. That is, no matter what the United States does, what violence it commits, it is always the victim. And because it assumes that sort of hegemonic posture, then it doesn't matter what it does. And its violence is therefore always deemed morally superior and justified. There's also not really any sort of effort, right, to examine the US's role in creating, sustaining, and perpetuating this, quote, terrorist threat. The United States can never seem to figure out what is driving or causing people around the world to respond with violence towards its actions. And in the book, I talk about a lot of the narratives, the official narratives, whether it's Bush, Obama, Trump, and how they perpetuate this violence. And one of the ways, in particular, Bush talks about this, is that sort of we have to make history, right? And in doing so, and using history, as in a history that starts with the 9/11 attacks, we therefore can't look to the past to understand the violence the US has caused. We can only look at this particular moment in time. And when we do that, that means the only explanation for actions and behaviors and the challenges to US power are understood as irrational. There's nothing that could possibly explain this. So to address the war on terror and the last 20 years, in my book, I look at this through three primary ways. The first is through narrative. The second is through law and policy. And the third is through Muslim experiences. Now, it is often the case, I think, that literature examining the war on terror, either sort of deals with Muslim experiences alone, or policy and law alone, or narrative alone. And to me, I wanted to sort of bring together these different pieces to provide this holistic picture of the war on terror. So, for example, how does the narrative and how has the narrative shaped the violence that has been enacted vis-a-vis law and policy? How are Muslims experiencing the war on terror? And in this section in particular around Muslim experiences, it's not just about how they are being impacted and reacting to that violence, but also looking at the ways in which Muslims themselves have internalized these negative constructions of Islam and Muslims, and have in some cases participated in state violence because of the internalized ways that they have because of the ways they've internalized these constructions of Islam and Muslims. So this is a powerful way, right, to understand, in particular, this internalized Islamophobia, which, people have talked about it. It's not necessarily right. It's not unique to Muslims, but it's sort of an unfortunate way that Muslims then become participants with the oppressors. And in many ways, they can often make the oppression worse because they can exist in the capacity of rubber stamping problematic laws and policies because they have sort of Muslim approval. So when I looked at the narratives of the war on terror, there were different sort of ways I thought about it. So for example, there was a section in the book where I talk about where the heading is not a dent in the narrative. And this section of the narrative part of the book was really about the violence that the United States creates and the excuses and exceptions it presents once this violence is made known. I'm sure all of you are familiar with the Abu Ghraib abuse and torture that happened in Iraq in 2004. And of course, the response there was, there were just a few bad apples. And that's, fairly similar response to other acts of violence that have become known to the public. That this is an exception to the ways in which the US behaves and interacts with countries and populations in those countries. And the point of that section is really to say that no matter what the United States does, it narrates a picture that is unchanging. No matter what we do, we still are democratic, we still are just, we still don't commit acts of violence, and nothing we do will change that. It's this enduring narrative of the United States as an exception. And obviously that's a problem, right? Because then we don't understand and take stock of the totality of the violence that the United States has inflicted domestically and across the world. There's also narratives, particularly when it comes to Obama, who pioneered the Countering Violent Extremism program, where Muslims are kind of given this choice that, you can help us and help yourselves fight this violent extremism that's in your community, at least that we are telling you that's in your community. Theoretically, we're supposed to, agree with that as well. But regardless of whether or not Muslim communities in particular agree with the idea that violent extremism is a problem in our community, we're supposed to deal with it. And there's sort of this narrative that is, if you work with us and help us solve this problem, we'll work with you, we'll respect you. And if you don't agree with our assessment of a problem in your community, then you can expect to be treated differently. There's also, for example, perhaps some of you are familiar with a man named Khizr Khan, whose son died in the Iraq War. I think he's a Gold Star father. And the reason why, in my analysis, Khizr Khan was given such a platform, he's Muslim, is because he was an example of a good Muslim. He was an example of a family that could, at least in public spheres, support the wars. Maybe it wasn't outright support, but he didn't use that platform and the platforms he was given. He spoke on Hillary Clinton's campaign trail. He didn't use the platform to say, why did my son have to die in an illegal war? He used it to say, essentially, we are just as American as you. And my son fought in this war, and it doesn't get more American than that. So these are some of the problematic narratives. And it is always the case, right, that when you find such a Muslim who's willing to engage in that kind of discourse, that you get uplifted. Again, Khizr Khan was like, came to the stage and said, oh, these wars are illegal. These wars are war crimes. They constitute violence that amounts to war crimes. He would never have been given the platform. And so there's an aspect of this that's narrative, and there's an aspect of that is how are Muslims being impacted vis-a-vis internalized Islamophobia? And, something that I didn't spell out as much in the book, but that, I've been thinking about it and thinking through and conceptualizing is the idea of this war on terror apparatus. So when we talk about the war on terror apparatus, what does that actually mean? And it matters what it is because if we want to dismantle and embellish it again, right, we have to know what it is that we're talking about when we use the term and the word apparatus. So in my mind, the war on terror's apparatus is this policy and legal precedent. It's the discourse, and it's the enforcers. These are sort of the high level elements of the apparatus, right? So in other words, how do we begin to understand what is making the war on terror come to life? And it is through the discourse, the legal and policy precedents, and the enforcers. What are the agencies and institutions that are actually enacting the violence? So as someone who has also invested many years into research and writing and organizing and advocacy and activism, basically every sphere of sort of the nonprofit life, as well as just trying to get at this problem of Islamophobia through many different lenses and approaches. One of the goals I set out to do in the book was to understand what is the war on terror. So on September 20th of 2001, President Bush gave a speech, and this was a speech to the joint session of Congress, in which he used the war on terror for the first time, that phrase. And he said, quote, our war on terror begins with Al-Qaeda, but it does not end there. It will not end until every terrorist group of global reach has been found, stopped, and defeated. Okay, so here we have the war on terror being used for the first time as a phrase. And second of all, it's a very nebulous. What exactly does it mean for every terrorist to be gone off the face of the planet, especially if the United States is not going to critically examine any of its behaviors that leads to perpetuating violence? So I conceptualized this taxonomy of the war on terror. And this taxonomy is composed of 5 dimensions. So the 5 dimensions of the war on terror include militarism and warfare, draconian immigration policies, surveillance, federal terrorism prosecutions, and detention and torture. So my vision for this taxonomy, again, was to put some parameters around the war on terror. What actually does it mean? Additionally, I created this taxonomy because it's often been the case, at least in the past, that the war on terror has been narrowly understood as militarism and warfare abroad. Obviously, there are other things that have happened, in addition to the fact that what happens globally and domestically interact, despite this sort of attempt to separate them, right, as sort of disparate policies and laws. They are very much connected, especially if we are looking at the war on terror through the lens of Islamophobia. What happens there impacts what happens here, and vice versa. And sort of as a corollary to that, I also wanted to think about in this book, how are Muslims, what sort of violence is the state inflicting on Muslims? So I thought of 5 modes of violence that kind of define and are part of these 5 dimensions of the war on terror. So this includes corporeal, right? So violence done to the body and mind. Bordered, the ways in which borders are used, right, to determine humanity and to sort of leverage this idea of who deserves to exist and who doesn't. Panoptic, the ways in which we are constantly surveilled, in particular Muslims, to the point where the state can set up and has set up a very efficient surveillance apparatus such that many Muslims surveil themselves and therefore don't require the state for the surveillance to occur. Then juridical, for example, in the form of federal terrorism prosecutions, as well as places like Guantanamo. And I think one quote that sort of embodies this mode of violence at Guantanamo in particular is from a former prisoner named Nizar Sassi, who said, quote, "If you want a definition of this place," referring to Guantanamo, "we don't even have the right to have rights." So think about that. We're not talking about differential justice because we're not even getting to the point where there is participation in the legal system. I should say legal system because it is not a justice system. And that is very, very egregious as a form of violence, right? And then finally, carceral. Keep in mind that some of these modes of violence, there's sort of an overlap, right? Carceral and corporeal, there is definitely an overlap. And again, these modes of violence are meant to explain and sort of offer a picture of what results in terms of when the war on terror is enacted in terms of the 5 dimensions. So, one of the things I really focused on in the book as well was the extent to which Muslims have been dehumanized in the war on terror. And referring back to the Abu Ghraib scandal, I believe it was Rush Limbaugh who commented back in 2004 that basically they're the ones that are human scum, and they're the ones that are, quote, human debris, and very other like horrible ways of explaining and describing the victims, in fact. And I mentioned that in the book because in order for a victim to still occupy the place of a perpetrator, there has to have been a deep, deep level of dehumanization involved. When people cannot even see the violence that was done to you because of their perception of the identity that you are a perpetrator, then there's really nothing left, right, in terms of your humanity. And that has been the case throughout the war on terror. The Muslims are so dehumanized. You can think of a recent example, right? When US troops withdrew from Afghanistan and there was a subsequent attack where I believe it was 13 soldiers died. And in many of the reports, they would say 13 soldiers died or American troops died and many others. Who are those others? And why did those others not have numbers? Why? Right? And there's this particular goal of dehumanization. That is to make the violence seem less costly, right? That it exists on less of a scale than it actually does. And to disable people's ability to have remorse, right? Another example is when the Senate report on torture came out in 2014. There were opinion polls that came out around the same time, right? Assessing people's opinions towards the release of the, at least partial part of the report that was declassified, where one of the questions I remember being asked was basically, was the use of these torture tactics, and I'm not even sure if they described it specifically as torture, but was the use of these tactics, were they justified? So say, for example, the question was, is it ever justified to use torture in order to theoretically, right, secure national security? You can imagine that there may be some sort of acceptance or enthusiasm for using torture in general, if we didn't specify who it would be used on. But there's a specific caricature and identity of who specifically the torture is being inflicted on. And although these polls did not specifically ask about Muslims, we know that it was in reference to Muslims. And as a result, I believe it was at least half the people surveyed that said it was justified. Keep in mind, they didn't ask if it was moral, ethical, or legal, but if it was justified. And for those of you who are familiar with the report, the most egregious forms of torture and abuse are detailed in it. And again, you have to think about what populations and what groups. Of course, Muslims are not the only ones that could have been subjected to this. But what does it take for a group of people to endure brutality and torture, and for there not to be backlash, for there not to be an uprising? I don't want to digress too much, but one of the things that just occurred to me now is one of the individuals involved in the insurrection earlier this year apparently only ate organic food. So he had to request that he got organic food in prison, and he did. He was able to get organic food. Meanwhile, we have Muslims in Guantanamo. We have Muslims in communication management units that I also talk about. 2 prisons in the United States, in Marion, Illinois, and Terre Haute, Indiana, that are referred to as Guantanamo North and Little Gitmo, where they are treated as the most violent of the violent and are denied many of the rights that others, including in particular this example, right, of white prisoners might have. And the way I address it in the book is not just through this, sort of broad concept of dehumanization, but also through this idea of moral exclusion. And moral exclusion is a theory that was developed by an academic and professor named Susan Apatow. And really the idea is what behavior and treatment sort of becomes acceptable once people, such as Muslims in this case, are removed from your moral community. In other words, are there different standards of justice and fairness that you think about or that you apply to if you don't see certain people within your moral community? And that has absolutely been a part of the war on terror, right? It's to treat Muslims as others, so much so that we are removed again from this moral community where these standards of justice and fairness simply don't apply. So I think the last thing I'll address, at least for now, is the last chapter, or the last section, where I talk about both internalized Islamophobia as well as Muslim organizational responses to the war on terror. And I've talked a little bit already about internalized Islamophobia and just the general concept of internalized oppression. But when I looked at Muslim organizational responses, and there were not many, it was not meant to be a representative sample by any means. But I wanted to look at how they were responding to, in particular, the state's narrative around certain events and actions that had taken place. So, for example, when it came to the release of the CIA torture report, Muslim organizations, 2 in particular, Council on American Islamic Relations, as well as Muslim Public Affairs Council, essentially echoed the idea that torture is not who we are, who we being the United States, right? And didn't mention the fact that all of the victims were Muslim. Now, it is a problem, of course, when not only are you too afraid to mention who the victims are, in particular when you are an organization that advocates on behalf of Muslims, even if you have this sort of artificial divide between Muslims and Muslim Americans. But also when you're perpetuating mythical ideas that the United States puts out about itself. Torture has always been a part of this country. There's nothing new about torture post 9/11, except that the United States government went out of its way to sort of legally sanction it. But we pretty much can assume, right, based on the fact that there hasn't been any accountability, that legally sanctioned or not, most of the behavior and treatment probably would have occurred anyway. And so really what I wanted to get at with this section is to look at the ways in which Muslims are creating or not creating or narrowing the space that they exist in this sort of political sphere, right? You know, in part, we can empathize to some extent because there's a lot of pressure on Muslims and Muslim organizations to respond in particular ways. On the other hand, when we think about this idea of collective responsibility, for example, whenever there has been in the past an act of violence perpetrated by a Muslim, Muslims are uniformly asked to condemn this violence. And what does it do if we are sort of participating in that, right? Why should Muslims condemn? And this is not a novel argument, right? This is a question that's been asked by many Muslims. Why should we condemn the violence of others with whom we have no relationship? In my opinion, if I'm going to condemn something, it would be the use of my tax dollars to inflict violence onto communities domestically and globally, not violence that I am not part of, nor have any knowledge of. And this is a problem because a lot of Muslim organizations feel compelled to participate in this narrative and this sort of concept, right, that we have to be collectively responsible. And so, you know, there's a lot, I think, to be said about, you know, the different ways that Muslims have experienced the violence and are reacting to the violence. And obviously there's a huge range. Whether you are a Muslim who's been in the army and who supports involvement with such an institution, or whether, for example, you have a sibling who happens to be in a maximum security prison or supermax because of these federal terrorism prosecutions that are deeply entrenched with Islamophobia. Nevertheless, right, when we talk about this particular moment, right, you know, I hear a lot of Muslims always talking about this idea that we're at the crossroads. And the problem is we've been at the crossroads for like 20 years now. So what does it mean to get past that? When do we cross, right? And what does this mean? What are the spaces we are trying to create? And I can tell you my vision of that space is much different than other Muslims, naturally, right? Because we are not a homogenous entity. But just in thinking through some of sort of like what we might discuss afterwards, right? Just thinking about what political moment are we in? And to me, what are we going to do now, right? Muslims have, for example, tried to be acquiescent. Under Obama, they were somewhat subdued. And of course, this is in general terms. They were much more confrontational under Trump. But regardless, here we are 20 years later with the US's empire machine, imperialism in full force, with nothing actually fundamentally changing about the structures of this country that allow such violence to be waged. And so what do we do and how do we carve a path forward? Something I just want to end with is a reflection on some of my Guantanamo work, and in particular, a prisoner named Omar Hader. Some of you may know him. He was a Canadian citizen who was detained at the age of 15, making him one of the youngest prisoners at Guantanamo. He was used as a human mop, among many other torture tactics, and was brutally abused. And rather than the Canadian government advocating for his repatriation, they in fact participated in his interrogation. Omar Hader was charged and convicted with 5 war crimes, right? He was a child. There hasn't been a child who's been charged and convicted of war crimes since World War II. And one of the individuals, I believe, who's in the military, advised him and talked about this sort of Guantanamo paradox, where you, quote, have to lose in order to win, right? Think about that. He had to plead guilty to these war crimes in order to get out of Guantanamo. So he had to lose in order to win. So my question, I think, to end this portion of the event is, what are we willing, if anything, to lose in order to win? And how do we win? How is our wins, how can they be characterized as absolute wins? How can we get rid of and strip away everything problematic that has been part of the fight against the war on terror in the last 20 years and move forward towards a different future? One where we can begin to understand, conceptualize, and critique, reflect on how to dismantle and abolish state violence once and for all. And I'll stop at that.
All I can say is I feel stunned by everything you've said. It's really very powerful, very, very important for us to read your book and to think very carefully about some of the things you've said. I mean, there's so much you have woken me to. I'll just mention a couple of ones that are particularly strong in my mind right now. First, I think it's really very powerful that what you did in your book is that you have approached it in a rather holistic manner, that you haven't singly looked at this or this or this, but have tried to bring together the war on terror, the laws and policies, the experiences. I think that will make for a picture that's a little easier for us to grasp, maybe. But definitely, I'm going to read the book and then hopefully get back to you. I also am struck by something I always feel is true, that where you begin history is very critically important. If you start at 9/11 as the beginning of everything, and the war on terror is based on that moment, it just is not going to explain anything, because the entire history is there behind it. And if you don't address that, then people have just very gratuitously begun where it doesn't make any sense. And thirdly, I really am profoundly impacted by the thought you've put out that no matter what the United States does, or no matter what happens, the US is always the hero. It can never be wrong. Everything it does is somehow okay. And unless it's not just the state, we're talking about the people as well. And for some reason, the majority of people in this country would agree with its state that yes, we are a just country, we are a democratic country, we can do no wrong. But unless we can shift that narrative, how can anything change, really? And I just don't even know. It doesn't even only apply to militarism, it also applies to climate change, for instance. I mean, you've got these embedded ideas, and then I don't know how one shifts those. But anyway, I really, really thank you for this. You kind of addressed it, but I just wanted to bring up one thing that before we open up to everyone else. I'm hogging you a little bit. I was very impressed with this opinion piece you wrote earlier this year, where you address some really important questions that go to the very core of our human compact. You asked, why is the violence of state actors considered more morally acceptable than violence by individuals? Maybe you could just spend just a few minutes on that.
Sure. So thank you, Hayat, again for inviting me and for your thoughtful questions and reflection points. So Hayat is referring to a op-ed I wrote for Al Jazeera called On the Question of Moral Equivalence. And the reason I had written that piece, I think it was back in July, was because Ilhan Omar was receiving backlash for a comment she made about justice and sort of addressing the victims of the US, Israel, Afghanistan, and the Taliban. And of course, the backlash that followed was about how dare she compare the United States and Israel to the Taliban, or in other words, a state actor versus a non-state actor. And the premise behind that is, of course, that state violence is legitimate and justified, and that non-state actor violence is not inherently. We're talking about inherently, right? And we don't have to get into a debate about whether or not non-state actor violence, is legitimate on its own, or condemn it, as is usually the case, right? When you're trying to sort of deconstruct this argument. But to me, there was a very problematic point here. One, that by fixating on this idea that there absolutely cannot be any moral equivalence, that serves to whitewash the violence. And it is to say that we cannot be critiqued, right? Our violence cannot be critiqued, especially when you're comparing it to those other bad people, the non-state actors. And when I thought about drawing these comparisons, if we look at narratives, for example, there was a speech in 2006 that Bush gave in which he said, basically, he can't comprehend how people can kill women and children, and was really upset by any insinuation that the violence of the United States could be similar to the violence of others, again, in that same spirit of there cannot be any moral equivalence. Now, if we didn't know who was talking, and we didn't know the context, if you talk about women and children being killed, isn't it also the case, of course, as we know, that the United States has killed women and children? Absolutely. And a lot of the narratives that I looked at, again, the ones that were being used to describe the actions of the non-state actors could have easily described the violence that, in fact, the United States or other states, such as Israel, have engaged in and have inflicted. Now, we know that the idea of a state, right? The state is thought to have this sort of legitimate use of violence. And that necessarily means if the state has a legitimate use of violence, then non-state actors do not. Similarly, when you deconstruct and look at the ways in which terrorism itself is described, again, if you remove the actor who's responsible for the acts that are constructed as terrorism, they could easily describe either the state or these non-state actors. Now, for those who identify with this concept of the state, they're probably more readily prone to believe this idea that the state is morally superior, right? However, in order to really and to accurately make this comparison, in order to solve this problem of whether they are morally equivalent or not, it's not just about an inherent morality. It's about something that's measurable. Okay, so, we can talk about very specific details, right? How many people were killed, for example, right? What was the cause of the violence? There are many ways we can actually concretely measure. And the important thing about this, again, this argument that there is no moral equivalence, is that basically it's meant to eviscerate the possibility that there is a comparison that's made, because people that push back against it know, again, that if a comparison were to be made, that non-state act of violence would not stand out in terms of its brutality, in terms of its scope, in terms of its breadth, or any other factor, essentially, because state violence always usually takes the precedent when it comes to the scope, the seriousness, the brutality, et cetera, on violence. I hope that answers your question. Let me know.
Well, I'm sure we could have a longer discussion about this, but I really want to quickly not forget the important piece here, which is I want to let everybody know that the book sounds like something we all must read and should read. And we will be sending you a link by which you can get that book. You can pre-order, or you can order it on Amazon after January 25. So we will be sending you that. We'll also be sending you a recording of this whole talk. So Amar, do you think we should do some questions or?
Yeah, sure. We can take some questions from the chat. Okay, so we have a question here, Maha. Rosemary is asking, you say torture is not new, which is true. What is your analysis of why the Bush administration bothered to justify it? Is it just a logical progression of white supremacist megalomania / insanity?
I mean, my assessment would be that, in order to maintain the facade that the United States is, democracy, a nation of laws, et cetera, that by legally condoning torture, it makes it possible to preserve that narrative. I don't think it was done in the interest of, protecting the prisoners, obviously, because otherwise they wouldn't even approach torture, but they'd have, and they did. And so again, I think to me, my analysis would be specifically that it was done to preserve this narrative, right? And many of the narratives that I looked at talked about, explicitly would say, we do not torture. In fact, there's an interview with former CIA director George Tenet, and when the interviewer kept telling him, what about waterboarding? And he was very aggressive in responding, we don't torture, we don't torture, we don't torture, right? And so when you make it legal and you call it, you euphemize it as enhanced interrogation, then you can say we do not torture. And then you can also say we're still a nation of laws and a country that adheres to democratic rules.
Okay, great. Thanks, Maha. Have you done any research, or could you comment on like Hollywood, the use of Hollywood films and TV shows and perpetuating this racism?
Yeah, I mean, that's, a huge, when you look at images and constructions and stereotypes, Hollywood very much does perpetuate them. I think others have written more than I on this for sure, because that was not necessarily my focus in this book. But when we talk about sort of a broader look at how constructions of Muslims are being shaped in the larger discourse, it's not just the government, right? It includes the media, it includes Hollywood. And, I think one point of intersection would be the film Zero Dark 30, in which I think the directors of the film worked very closely with the CIA and produced this film to essentially say that basically torture worked. So I think that's a particular intersection, not just in terms of the construction of Muslims, but also in terms of a Hollywood film participating in the perpetuation of a certain idea in order to justify violence.
Yeah, okay. Okay, so we have another question in the chat. Does your book say anything about the way in which different nations with anti-Muslim leadership and anti-Muslim internal or regional policies have allied and made common cause with US Islamophobia, sharing the same talking points, false narratives, India or Israel, for example?
I do not talk about that in the book because, as you can imagine, trying to undertake an analysis of 20 years of the US war on terror on its own was a great feat. However, I think, when I think about this question, I think there's two ways to think about the war on terror generally. And the first way is to think about how other countries participated in the US's war on terror. So sort of helping to further the violence. For example, France being part of the US's military apparatus in countries such as Afghanistan and Iraq. But then there's also a second part, which I think comes to countries such as India and Israel, which is that other countries have used this blueprint that the US has created for the war on terror to enact policies internally to fight their own war on terror. So I think it is a very important point. And I think when we talk about global Islamophobia and this sort of global, hatred of Muslims and how, different policies in different countries feed off of each other, it's very important. But my starting point for this book was really just to take a critical look at the US-led war on terror. But I think it is a very important point. And I think that there's definitely a lot of case studies, for example, the Uyghurs in China, where you can see the ways in which these countries are participating in the US's direct violence, as well as waging their own violence on the basis of this blueprint.
Okay, and there is
let's just quickly check in with everybody. We hope you'll stay on a little bit longer. Maha has very kindly said that she will stay on just a little longer so we can get a few more questions in. And I hope you found this illuminating enough to stay a little longer.
okay. So next question from the chat. There's a question asking, so how can we change the people's hearts and minds about Islam and Muslims?
I kind of struggle with this kind of question because, it's as though the onus to change, basically it is presented, right, as the onus is on Muslims to change perceptions of themselves that they have not created or, participated in the creation of. So I think that is a heavy burden to bear. And, we're now in the internet age, people can easily do their own research and learn more about Muslims. And I think, what Muslims can do is just to be themselves. I don't think, it does us any favors to, try to portray how American we are, or try to portray how patriotic we are, present different elements of Islam in a positive light in a way that may not seem genuine. I just, personally, that does not resonate with me. I think of the ways like I've led my own life. I've volunteered at numerous places, right? And I'm not necessarily going there with the objective of changing people's hearts and minds, but I'm acting as a Muslim in service of others, which I believe is a tenet of Islam. And people can deduce from that what they want. So I do think, sometimes I think that sort of frame is very problematic. And, it's not on the oppressed to push back and create, the images that the oppressor has created of them. And I think, one of the problems is like when we talk about media, who has more access to the media, right? Muslims often have far less access to the media. And so how do we even do that, right? How do we even change these perceptions when there aren't as many platforms that are afforded to us? So I think, I maybe I'll just leave it at that, but I do think, it's a problem it's a question worth rethinking about what are some of the assumptions about why it is Muslims that have to do that work.
Yes. Okay. Hi, did you have any further questions? Oh, you're muted.
Have you covered everything on the chat?
I think so. There's another question in the chat, but I think I think the response Maha gave kind of applies to this question as well, where they're asking, to what extent do you think, Dr. Hilal, that the attacks on the Munich Olympics contributed to Islamophobia in the West. Are there examples of it in mainstream culture prior to 1972? Also, are global Muslims a proxy to counter the Black Muslim movement in the US? I don't know what the last part is referring to exactly.
Yeah, I can just maybe answer the first part, and then maybe if Faisal wants to maybe add some context. I mean, yeah, sure, of course, Islamophobia is nothing new, whether you call it Islamophobia or anti-Muslim racism or whatever it is you use to describe the abuse and demonizing construction of Muslims, it has very much been a part of this country from its inception with the enslavement of Black Muslims. So it's nothing new. I mean, I think the issue is just with some of the narratives, again, around the historical piece and what led to the war on terror and how the violence that is, attributed to Muslims is characterized as sort of being irrational and not in response to the violence of the United States. So I think, yeah, very much Islamophobia has always been a part of this country. It's just been articulated and thought about in different ways. If I was going to try to answer the other question, I guess I'm not sure. I thought I could maybe understand, but I'm not exactly sure what how to answer the part about a proxy. I don't know if Faisal is still here. Oh, I see Faisal. I don't know, Faisal, if you want to say anything or, oh, the Nation of Islam.
Yeah, the question's a little unclear to me as well. Faisal, we can unmute you and if you want to, I think East. Yeah, did you see that, Maha?
Oh, hold on, let me look, sorry. Oh, no, I mean, I don't, I think everything is about framing. And, I think there's a lot to be said about, the way that the Nation of Islam has been used to sort of as sort of the intersection of anti-Blackness and Islam. And I think that that's definitely like a good discussion to have. I myself am not very familiar with the sort of narratives around the Nation of Islam, but I do think that a lot of the conversation around the Nation of Islam is somewhat separate from these sort of mainstream discourses around the war on terror, although it may play a role. But also I think they're specifically used to put a deeper wedge into more deeply entrenched, in my opinion, anti-Blackness in this country, and using Islam sort of as like a convenient add-on because Islam is, already being demonized in the mainstream. But I may be totally wrong because this is not necessarily my area of expertise. So I apologize if I didn't answer that question.
Well, I think all of us are probably burbling with questions and needs to talk to you more, Maha. But I just want to tell you how much we appreciate the time you've given us, and also as a reflection, say how hard it must have been for you to delve into this whole arena with such depth, and how has that been? Maybe I'll just end with giving you a little bit of space to say how you coped with that and what gives you joy and how do you move forward?
Well, thank you for asking. I mean, I think, writing the book was very, very, very challenging. I started writing in the beginning of, like towards the beginning of COVID. And, the work that I do has centered on the war on terror for many years now. So it's not a digression, but I do think, it does take an emotional and mental toll on, it took one on me for sure. Just reading about accounts of torture and just the massive amounts of violence inflicted on Muslims. And because of the fact that I am a Muslim, right, just thinking about, what this means about the marginalization and exclusion of my community from who was considered human and deserving of rights and who's not. So it was definitely very, very, very difficult to write. And I think at a certain point, I was operating on autopilot because it is often the case it has often been the case for me that if I stop and take a break, that the processing of the information in depth sort of brings more pain. So I'm grateful to be done with this book. I'm grateful to have people that want to engage in the book's contents. And I think, and I'm, hopeful that what I endured and what other authors, writers, activists, organizers endure, right, to make this world a more just place is in benefit and service to others.
Well, we thank you so much for that service, and you've put an output that will stay with all of us. So we wish you lots and lots of good sales for your book. Everybody on should really look at it. If you found this illuminating and interesting, please get the book, and we will send you a way for you to reach it. And we know that people will benefit from your work, and we also wish you good supports in your life and as you continue your work. And I know we'll hear from you again. Thank you so much, Maha. Take good
Thank you so
care of
much.
yourself.
Thank you, Omar.
Thank you, everyone, for joining.
Thank you. Thank you.